there's no common practice around product development, and it is creating problems. You have more subjective decision making because of limited visibility, and you have minimal cross-functional collaboration. Dependencies can be an element of that, which is kind of on that complexity side of things. And then you have inconsistent prioritizations.
I'm Pulkit Agrawal, and this is the Product Lunchbox, the bite-sized series for product people. In less time than it takes for you to eat lunch, we'll share some distilled insights and tactics from an experienced product operator on a single topic per episode.
I'm excited to welcome Lindsey to the podcast on the Product Lunchbox. Lindsey caught my attention because she's been a senior product person, senior director of product management at Foursquare, but she's also had product operations roles at Rapid and then now Aerospike. And so she's gone between product and product operations, and she's helped improve efficiency, alignment, and worked across different industries. So I'm really excited to talk to her about creating governance and product at different stages. So welcome, Lindsey.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
So let's just get started with a real basic recap. What does product operations mean? What is product ops?
Everyone's favorite question. And it's a loaded one because I feel like, I don't know, when I started my time in product operations, there was no definition. Then there was a time in which there were many definitions. And I think we're kind of coming to an alignment, which I think is creating some tension, which is fun. I like it. About a year ago, I was worried that it might go in a direction that I didn't align with my perspective, but luckily that's not been the case so far. So fingers crossed that remains true. But the way that I like to think about it is it's shepherding good product practice. Very generalized terms. I do that purposefully because I think it is so dependent on stage and need. Just like I think product management in general is different by stage and need. I do think there are some constants, and I have had to create a slide on this before. So the visual is something that I've tried to articulate in words in previous conversations, but it's one that stuck with me, which is this temple of Zeus. So if the roof of our temple is good product strategy, which good is not a good description, doubled up there, but it encompasses things like strategy development, discovery, conversations, customer engagement, all the things that we would say are the pillars of product, that I kind of put in this roof. So we're supporting all of what good product would be. And there are 3 pillars that hold it together. The first of which is go-to-market and customer interlock. I think a lot of people think that it's just customer interlock, but, depending on B2C, B2B, the go-to-market relationship is also extremely strong. So this is things like the coordination between product marketing, sales around launch. It could mean customer feedback process and engagement interviews. How do we do that? How do we engage with the right folks and have a nice distribution of what we think that should be, would be an example. The second pillar is tools and effectiveness. This is the one that I think for the longest time has been pretty standard, which is what are the tools that we use? What are the processes that we use to be our most efficient? Some people like to think that process does not equal efficiency. I'll have some opinions on that we can talk about later, but I don't like to use the word process. I more say process experiments. So just by adopting a tool doesn't mean it's going to be effective. And that's why I say tools and effectiveness. Similarly with process and effectiveness. Just because it's a process doesn't mean it's effective. The third pillar is data and insights. And I think this is the one that's gained the largest amount of popularity in recent years. Companies like LinkedIn and Uber, Melissa Perry's perspective on product operations sits very much in this data and insights category, where it's just taking information and creating action. So that could be on the strategic front. It could be on the customer feedback front. It could be product analytics. There's a couple of different segments that can build that, but ultimately it's how do we make strong decisions to support the strategy that we want to go with. The last thing that I'll mention that I think is pretty critical, especially as we talk about different phases of companies, that is the foundation of people. If we think about those pillars, we can't think about them without thinking about people. If we're trying to support good decision-making with information, we have to also account for the culture of our company, the one that we have, but also the one that we think we need to be successful.
Amazing. Okay, so the product ops piece of these 3 pillars. First one is the kind of interaction coordination between the customer-facing teams, essentially, and product. Second is the tools and their effectiveness in enabling you to run the product processes. or process experiments. And then the third is data and insights. And I love that model because it feels like that could be applied to pretty much any function. We're seeing obviously revenue ops was like a precursor in a way to product ops. Marketing ops is becoming a function. Maybe there'll be a world where there'll be kind of coordinated ops functions for all functions. But this is fantastic. So maybe let's do a kind of a follow-up on this. Does it mean that, or how does this framework, these pillars change based on stage of company or stage of product? Should one pillar be stronger or bigger at earlier stage companies, or do we need to focus on each of them in the same way?
Yeah, I have lots of opinions on this, but I'll start with just an example of a pillar that I think is the most dynamic, which is that data and insights piece, right? If you're a startup, the volume of data that you're working with, the volume of customers that you're working with is not the same as if you were at an Uber. Same with a B2B or a B2C, right? That dynamic is entirely different. So I think in terms of how that pillar might be more dominant than others, only because of the sheer volume and complexity. So you could use the word governance for this if you wanted, thinking about all the pillars to support good strategy as well as people and culture as governance. A lot of people don't love that because it's a little bit of a vibe of command and control, which is certainly not the intention at all, because it must be flexible. Governance implies it's like this all the time. That's not necessarily the case. So early stage startups thrive on the flexibility. So too much governance at this stage is an anti-pattern, right? It slows momentum. Momentum is one of the most critical things that you need at that time. But risk aversion creeps in as the company scales. And that's where I feel that governance word comes in as trying to provide a safety net and almost like I want to control where things are going. And this is like Marty Kagan wrote an article about process people. I want to say it's probably a year or two now, but he calls that out as also an anti-pattern in product. If you're too rigid, even at larger scales, you're not inherently able to pivot based on new information. So the process people in my mind is like, hey, we've defined the thing, it's going to get done and all will be well. And I think we all know that that's not the case. The doing is actually what drives the impact across these things, as well as the evolution of what we're doing. So
it's almost like you have to take a product management mindset into this, like learning quickly from what's working, testing. And we've seen even larger organizations, like I know I was listening to a podcast with the VP product of Ramp, and they talked about how they accelerated growth in certain products, and they built a small team to bring that motivation, that momentum and speed. So it means it's exceptionally, exceptional that you as a product person are like working on this problem, because you can apply those principles to product ops.
And that's what makes it the most fun. To me, the value that I get out of my job is the indirect impact. I loved product management. I think it's great. I think strategically, my brain, especially as you kind of go up the ladder in product management, it becomes more strategic, and I really like how that tickles my mind. But I would like to be one step away, because it makes me feel like I'm one to many in terms of effectiveness, in terms of decision making. So I could impact many strategies.
Yeah, it's almost like you're leading from behind. You're like an enabler and like supporting all of these other teams. So like that, I presume that's how you think of it. Like, should other product managers who are, aspiring for growth in their careers consider product ops as a function? I mean, I don't know who gets into it and what the pathways are, but would love some advice on how to make the most of your product management career through product ops.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's already happening. I know I keep referencing like a few years ago, but watching it evolve over time has been really fun. I think, product ops has been done by product managers forever. So it's not that that's like a new thing, right? It's just that it's being focused on as a unique skill and being prioritized. Really, that's the only difference. I think product managers are fully capable. It just depends on where you get your value from. Like a launch would come around and the launch is great. And, the next day you come in and you have feedback to kind of filter in, and it's just a churn through that stuff. That can be really fun. But if you're looking for something that is even more dynamic than that, which is like difficult to even consider, especially if you're working on sprint cycles and things that are really fast, is more dynamic just on the sheer volume of people that you are empowering. I do think that product managers, so I'm just going to stick on this example of a launch. Like, I'm going to have a defined cohort that I'm going to bring through a beta. I've created constraints so that I can make my decisions. In my role, I have very limited constraints, which is really fun. That's why I like it. So I do think from a career development perspective, there's pros and cons to it, just because it is a limited function being that one-to-many. I would also say financially, it's a little different right now. So if you're a product manager and it's something that you enjoy, go for it. But also know that product management has kind of solidified itself in a way. I do think product operations is still figuring it out, and that ambiguity can be uncomfortable for some people.
Yeah. So in the early days of a company, you probably don't have a product ops person, but you probably may have a PM, or you might have a person that's leading product, could be a co-founder. So presumably they're doing the product ops pieces themselves inherently or implicitly. And so I guess, what are the triggers, or what are the signals that it's time to have a specialist person do product ops? Do you have any sense of that?
I think all of it comes down to the balancing of short-term needs versus long-term priorities. And of course, the different stages of a company have different ratios in which they think about those things. I mentioned the momentum need for a startup is more important than potentially, a year from now, or the way that they think about time horizons is different. So I think that's one thing to acknowledge. There's kind of that, there's a maturity scale, and there's also a complexity scale that you could kind of plot your organization on. But there's plenty of reading out there: storming, norming, startup, whatever, growth. Like, there's so many words for it all. Unfortunately, I'm going to use 3 new ones, but maybe I hope that they make sense. Maybe they're not new. I don't know, but I don't know who to reference. So I would say you have a foundational, which to me is sort of that startup phase. You have scaling, which is that growth phase. And you have optimizing, which is, I wouldn't say the peak of maturity, but there are some indicators as to what that is. So at the foundation phase, what you're really looking at is there's no common practice around product development, and it is creating problems. You have more subjective decision making because of limited visibility, and you have minimal cross-functional collaboration. One team, so dependencies could be an element of that, which is kind of on that complexity side of things. And then you have inconsistent prioritizations. The last one is less of an indicator, because reprioritization should be a healthy habit, especially at this stage. But if it feels like we're swarming around things with limited value because we don't know the story, that's the ultimate indicator to me. So this is when product ops can come in and address foundational things, like how do we want to work? What are our principles? How do we get visibility into metrics and start thinking about the systems that should be scaled? This is really where we're thinking about aligning the product teams around product market fit, more so than like a long-term success roadmap. So obviously those practices around discovery and execution are almost more important than what I would say optimizing for, obviously those things go hand in hand, but if you get something to market that doesn't make sense, you've risked that possibility, and that's not something that you want to do at that stage.
So it sounds like it would still likely be more relevant if you've got multiple teams or multiple PMs working on this. Or do you think it's because then that's when you can really see the disjoints of like, hey, how are the decisions being prioritized, or the level of quality and discovery in coming to the solution? So we want to make that better, make it more visible, so the leadership knows like how these teams are performing relative to each other and getting best of all. So is that right?
Yeah, and I think if like we take that matrix and maybe make it 3D, that complexity line is around the market as well as your product and technology. Because how you decide to structure your teams, whether it be I'm trying to think of what would be a complex market, but nothing is coming to me, but multiple teams may not be true, but multiple needs may be true. And the ability to prioritize across those needs, if you will, would be like a more complex market. Like
you might have multiple buyers or multiple user personas. Like we talked about Ramp earlier. Like that's a good example, I think, because you're selling to finance people, but you've got the individuals who are using it. You've got a sales assist motion, product led motion. You're trying to expand to new markets and new verticals. It's like there's a lot of complexity. Even if that was in the early days, maybe there's need for it.
Yeah, that's a great one. And I think transitions nicely into the growth stage, because I do think like the PLG motion with a B2B motion does increase that complexity, which to me means maybe we now have a higher volume of data. We have a growth team that is more horizontal than what we'd had ever before. Maybe we're trying to figure out what the hell product-led growth even is, but we're not sure if that is a market we want to enter. So there also is, I might have an alternative perspective than some folks. And I think that product operations can also step into a strategy or business operations space in the sense of, I'm going to do some preliminary investigation alongside my CPO or CEO to support whether that trajectory is the right one to explore before, let's say, hiring a growth team. So that's kind of on that like transition phase from that scaling into growth. How do we want to go into that next phase? I do think the product ops team can help work through that, especially as kind of the governors, the data and insights piece, as well as, our practice and what we've seen work well and not work well.
Yeah. I think of like, as an early stage founder myself, like if I'm going to hire a product ops person, it's so much more valuable if they can go a bit beyond just that role, and they can do some of that business analysis or, do some of the data, gathering the insights, or maybe even on the other side, like maybe do a little bit of the research themselves, the discovery themselves, so they can be well grounded in the real product world and then use that to shape the product process. So maybe that there is like, and if, to me, I've encouraged hiring internal operations or kind of people operations earlier than it might feel like you need it, because that can really help set the people and culture and foundation to build those pillars. So in a similar way, maybe founders or leaders should think about hiring product ops earlier than they may expect, so that they can have the right foundations to then enable their product teams to grow.
Yeah, totally. I think if you're already thinking about it, you probably needed it a couple months ago. Because I do think that like this is such an overgeneralization, but I'll say it. Like I think that product leaders and engineering leaders, myself included, like you play a certain role, right? And you have certain priorities. And to think that you can manage all of operations at some point is not possible. And it's okay to acknowledge that it's not possible. My experience has been that I don't think it's a factor as to whether they think they want to prioritize it. It's whether they think they can do it themselves. And that's when you can get in a bit of a pickle thinking that it's an easier thing than it actually is, because the culture items come into play. The how we work shouldn't necessarily be a dictatorship, right? That like there has to be flexibility involved. Maybe we remove that piece.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be authoritarian. Let's say you want it to be flexible enough. And that means, to your point, if you treat this like a product itself, it is more complex than just delivering a process. If it was just delivering a process and thinking that process stood the test of time, I wouldn't exist. But people in a system make it complex. And complex systems are difficult to manage and require a lot of finesse over time, even on like a quarterly basis, to get us to a maturity level that we want, not just like a year and multi-year basis.
And then maybe just to flip that a little bit, like let's say someone is trying to do it themselves, or let's say you're a PM and you don't have a product ops function, you're not able to like make that happen. What are things you should focus on, or maybe what are the first steps to focus on to help improve the quality of the product strategy ultimately? Is there a go-to pillar? Is it completely contextual and dependent? How would you help someone think about how can we get ahead just by me taking some actions?
I think that product operations helps implement and run the target operating model that you want for your business. I think a good first investigation is documenting the operating model that currently exists. And I don't mean that from the perspective of document every single process. That's not really what I mean. It's like, what are the behaviors that I'm working with as it stands today? And if I were to draft where I want to be, given as a founder, CEO, CPO, where I know I want to be in a year or 6 months, can those behaviors continue?
And what's an example of that? Is that like, okay, this is how a bug is reported, this is how we triage it, this is how we just prioritize it and ship it, and we've like mapped that out as a process? Like what is it? How does it manifest as target operating model on a document?
Yeah. So target operating model is built across what is our organizational design and philosophy. So let's say we're at a growth stage company, and this is coming from experience, we have more engineering managers than we do product managers. And we're seeing as a result of that, which maybe the diagnosis might come later, but as the symptom that we're seeing is we're releasing great technology, but it falls flat in the market. It could be a marketing problem, or it could be a product problem. I would argue it's probably a product problem. So in that instance, that's our current state. Our organizational design is leading to this effect, which probably has some other root causes like a lack of product discovery. Maybe product managers are functioning more as product owners. Like you get kind of the root cause analysis of problems. Now in my target, what I might want to articulate is that I don't want things to fall flat in the market. It's expected for things to fail, so I don't want those things to be confused. But like we should have tried our dangdest to get it right. And that requires a good amount of research, which means that I need product managers with the capacity to do the research. Oh, and also there's kind of this industry standard that there should be a 2 in a box so that that group of a product manager and engineering team can prioritize together across things like new features, bugs, incidents, the diversity of things that engineering teams need to manage. It's a single roadmap in that instance. So that's an example of like documenting current state and the root causes and saying, here are the things I want to see. How would I back into that information? It sounds more complex than I think it is. I think people already know what the problems are and how they're showing up. It's just trying to understand what is causing them to find the right solution for them. In my experience, it's usually a lack of alignment. It's usually a staffing challenge. It's usually limited cross-functional collaboration with sales and marketing, data blind spots because the decisions we're making are hard to make without that. Even, data blind spots would be the objective quantitative source, but also qualitatively, maybe we have blind spots. So on the interview front, the other common symptom I see is reactive decision making. Not the healthy pivot, but I heard this new thing and it's kind of a one thing and I latched. It's a biased decision making. And it's not a root cause, but sometimes if you are that product leader and you can't see these problems, it also probably means you don't have the visibility that you need. Mm-hmm. And that might be the first indicator that you have. If I can't spot this stuff and I don't know, but I'm only seeing these symptoms, maybe you need to get somebody in to diagnose and then do, which to your point, like in that scaling, you want somebody that can kind of do the breadth of it. That research on that front is the most important. And it's a pretty minimal investment, really, compared to the, broader R&D spending in the world.
Yeah, it sounds like very much like, it'd be helpful for many teams and many like founders or early stage product teams to like do an audit of like, hey, where do the problems exist within the product function? And I wonder if there's maybe there are consultants that help with this audit, or maybe there's like a GPT that can ask you a bunch of questions that you can then answer, and it helps you figure out like, oh yeah, there are some issues here that you might need a product ops person to solve. But really
shameless plug, I do have that target operating model written down in a blog post. There are a lot of great product operations consultants that audit and that first research kind of session is a big key element to their package. So even if you don't want to invest in somebody full time, absolutely. Or even just have a phone call with someone like me or somebody with it in their title or whatever. The community of product ops is fantastic because it's emerging. So we're all trying to say like, hey, this is a really good idea. Is it good for you? I don't know. Let's talk about it. Because we're also learning as to how we're going to evolve too.
That's awesome. Okay, so how should people find you?
LinkedIn is a good one. Yeah, Lindsey Shea used to be Lindsey Bell, if you know me from then. But yeah, that's where I'm at. I'm also on Product-Led Alliance Slack channel. There's a few other ones that I'm on. Pretty much any product ops forum, I've got some tied to.
Okay, great. All right, and then let's end with a couple of quick fire questions. What are your go-to resources for learning about product generally?
Product generally, we just talked about LinkedIn. I do scroll that. My husband makes fun of me because he's like, really, this is how you want to spend your time? It's definitely become more of a social media platform than ever before. And I think there's some AI generated content, but also some good content still. I also mentioned the Product-Led Alliance Slack channel. That's a place where I'm getting real time. People are asking questions all the time. People are sharing their opinions across, a large volume of companies. I really like, going back to the LinkedIn comment, I really like John Cutler's content. His systems thinking and approach is so unique. Sometimes I have to read something 3 times to understand it. It makes me feel kind of dumb, but that's how I prefer to learn. And Melissa Perry is a constant, and she's definitely been leaning into the product operations piece, but still closely tied to what good product looks like. So it's a good combo for me.
Great recommendations for folks to follow. Well, it was so fun to have you. I learned a lot. There's I probably have to listen to this a few times to get all of my learnings out of it. But thank you for joining, and we hopefully will have folks being in touch with you, and we'll see the development of product ops together.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to come again, and happy to chat with whoever reaches out. So send me a note.
I appreciate it.